Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. It's great to see you all. Welcome to the ServCollab Ideation workshop on refugee well-being. With this workshop, we hope to bring together like-minded participants to discuss and identify potential projects to collaborate on issues related to refugee well-being. In today's first workshop, we are very lucky to have three great panelists. Dr. Silke Bönig from Hamburg, Germany, Dr. Cliff Schultz from Chicago, and Dr. Usha George from Toronto, Canada. So in this workshop, I will have some questions at the beginning for our panelists, and then we will open it to some Q&A at the end. So please feel free to share your questions on the chat. And also, we will make some announcements for the next steps at the end. So without further ado, let's start with my first question for our panelists. So please tell us about your background and your interest in refugee immigrant-related research. What inspired you to do research about refugees or other individuals with vulnerabilities? Silke, should we start with you?
Yeah, good morning, good evening, everybody. So I'm very delighted and happy. Thanks for the invitation that we can discuss topics on well-being today. My background is business administration. As some of you may know, I come from Germany and studied their business administration at the University of Münster. And then for my PhD, I was at the University of Basel and studied services, marketing and management. And then I moved slowly from the cultural context more and more into the nonprofit context. And today I'm a professor for nonprofit management. And yeah, during the refugee crisis, of course, I was passionate about the new incoming refugees. So that is, yeah, quickly my background on the topic.
Thank you. Usha, can we go with continue?
Okay. Okay. I myself is an immigrant. I came to Canada in 1990. But before that, I lived in different countries. I lived in Ethiopia. I lived in Nigeria. I went to school partly in the US. In all those places, it was interesting to see how outsiders were treated, so to speak. In Chicago, where I was a graduate student, it was really interesting to see how ethnic communities kind of worked on their own. They were so distanced from what we call the mainstream community. And I kind of looked at their lives and said, well, this is like an enclave where people are kind of doing most of the things within themselves. And, you know, this whole idea around mixing and coming together with different groups is totally absent. I fast forward, I came to Canada in 1990, as I said, and my first job was to be the executive director of, so in all these countries, I was teaching at universities. I taught at the then Haile Selassie University, then in Nigeria in two different places. So when I came to Canada, of course, you know, getting a job is so hard. You know, there are thousands of PhDs who cannot get into a particular labor market. So I was lucky to get a job immediately to become an executive director of an agency which looked after South Asian women who were experiencing family violence. And there also I found that the services that we provide, the advice that we give these women have to be within the legal boundaries of these issues, but then we had to be culturally sensitive and literally linguistically appropriate. So my general background is social policy and social work. That's where I graduated in different places, starting with a master's in sociology. And ending with a PhD in again, sociology and social policy. So in 93, I was lucky to get into University of Toronto as an assistant professor in the tenure track. And there I actually, of course, you have to do significant amounts of research. And immediately, my interest was on immigrants and refugees because of my own experience as an immigrant in Canada, my own experience of watching other immigrants in different parts of the world. So that's how I came to sort of work on or work with immigrants and refugees. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. Khalid?
Good morning or good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. And thank you, Sirtan, for organizing this. It's clearly an important issue in an important time in human history. I am trained as a social psychologist, earned my PhD at Columbia University, and was fortunate enough to have a couple of people from the business school on my dissertation committee who encouraged me to do a postdoc in the business school, which I did, and I've been in the marketing space in various capacities ever since. My dissertation was essentially on the efficacy of Machiavellian sales tactics on Wall Street. And just after the ink had dried on that topic, when we were still using ink, I thought, I just can't study this for the rest of my life. And the world at that time was shifting from command economies to market economies. And I thought, this is the space to be in. This is quite interesting. And so I was invited to come to many places around the world to talk about this transition to market in Vietnam and so on. And I was invited to go to Croatia, which was separating from the disintegrating Yugoslavia, to talk about this transition to the market. And while I was there, the war had broken out and refugees were streaming in from eastern Slavonia, the eastern part of Croatia along the Danube River, and in from Bosnia. And instantly it became obvious that the story was not data about transitioning to the market, but human beings and the profound suffering caused by war and other forms of bad policy and devastation. And so, to stand in Banja Luka Square in Zagreb and just see people coming in, or then hiring a UNHCR vehicle out to Karlovac and seeing these people with faces, looks on faces that still haunt me, and hearing their stories and doing impromptu interviews with a couple of my Croatian colleagues, and the atrocities being perpetrated and what they were doing to children, just unspeakable things that were unimaginable could be happening anywhere in the late 20th century, truly was transformative. And I committed then to help vulnerable people and groups around the world, and clearly refugees and other forcibly displaced people. So I'm deeply engaged in this focus now. Have active projects in Lebanon, the Bekaa Valley, where there are still about 350,000 Syrians. Northern Iraq, focusing largely on the Assyrian population and Yazidis. Colombia, just finished a 50-year civil war, many forcibly displaced people, and now 1 million Venezuelans streaming into Colombia. I've been working in Myanmar, Cambodia. It's sadly too many places to list here. And in my own town, Chicago now, with the Assyrian community, principally the Burundi community, and so on. So that's a bit of my story, and excited to be here and to discuss some of the topics that we've arranged today.
Thank you, Cliff. I mean, it's great to hear your personal stories, because as our audience may notice, you three are coming from quite 3 different backgrounds, with different experiences, with different degrees, and that was intentional. So, let's just go to the heart of the topic. Based on your experience, based on your academic research, personal experiences, what are some of the refugee-related research themes and questions that we need to pay more attention and study in the near future? What some specific themes or questions require our attention from research community? Who wants to go first? I don't want to call on names. But, so maybe Usha, can we go with you, Usha?
Right. Oh, sure.
Usha.
Hi, yeah, sure. Thank you. Once again, thank you for organizing this panel. Yeah, I forgot to say that in the beginning. Okay, the refugee-related topics that we need to pay attention to, and they are literally, I would argue, are permanent topics, are one, settlement issues of refugees. In Canada, we have different kinds of refugees in terms of the policy implementation. We have government-sponsored refugees, privately sponsored refugees, and blended visa refugees. Whatever it is, they are all coming to Canada. But the privately sponsored refugees have an advantage over the government-sponsored refugees, that we always argue, because the sponsorship groups actually provide a lot of real support to these refugees, in addition to settlement services that are totally available to all refugees. But the fact is that settlement services funded by the federal government are not able to reach all refugees, nor do all refugees feel comfortable to go there. Or even when they go there, some of them are not satisfied with the services. So there are always settlement issues. And usually when you talk about settlement issues, we are talking about a number of dimensions. I have had the good luck actually to, the opportunity to actually study large flows of refugees from Afghanistan, Iraq, and what's the other? And Syria, and former Yugoslavia. They were all refugees. These refugees were brought in by the Canadian government into this country, and I had the opportunity to study their needs and settlement issues and so on. And even, and I have studied also a number of immigrant groups. So it's interesting to see that basically all the settlement needs are the same. Access to employment is the biggest one, or labor market issues are big. Access to housing, then access to healthcare, knowledge about services, and also establishing social networks, creating social capital. These are common for all newcomers, I would say. But for refugees particularly, there are issues around mental health as well as family reunification. Family reunification, even in this morning's newspaper, they said the Afghan refugees who have arrived here about probably during the last 2 months are already asking for family reunification, because the traumatic situation under which they left the country left a lot of their families back home. And I just completed a study of Syrian refugees, about 400 of them, at different focus groups and surveys and so on. Family reunification was one of the biggest issues they all talked about. So family reunification affects settlement as well as integration of refugees into the mainstream society or the host society. So these are all topics that we need to kind of focus on. And then, of course, there is the whole issue around asylum seekers. That they are also treated as a totally different category. But it's interesting, I'll just stop in 1 minute. Interesting to see that during the COVID crisis, a number of asylum seekers were actually recruited or allowed to work in long-term care homes as personal assistants and so on. So in fact, even though we kind of said that asylum seekers are illegal immigrants and so on, the point that they became really critical in the provision of essential services to the COVID-related process actually opened the eyes of the government, and they are actually in the process of giving permanent residence for some of the qualified asylum seekers. So asylum processing, the time it is taking, all of that is again another different dimension that we need to talk about. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. By the way, for our audience, they had kind of homework before this workshop. They had some recommended reading list. I hope they all did that. And I will follow up with another email after this with additional homework. So I hope our audience is taking notes from all these research ideas and topics. Silke, what's your take on it? What are some of the themes, questions that require our attention?
Yeah, several questions, of course. So first of all, I think that on all levels, on the micro level, on the organizational meso level, and also on the macro level, there are so many interesting and relevant topics. So, for example, on the macro level, I think we need to focus on how can we avoid, on the question, how can we avoid refugee camps? So when you look on the situation in Greece, for example, and on all other places, so people living in refugee camps, not only for, let's say, 1 or 2 years, they live there for 15 years longer, and the situation is dramatic and no hope, no access to basic services. So I think refugee camps, that is really an important and also a very holistic topic that we can all contribute to. And another topic I think it's also relevant is the question not only to talk about refugees, but to research with refugees, so that, for example, how can we enable refugees to build up their own businesses and topics like that, and more taking more and participating a research approach. I think that could also be a topic, and several other topics. So we all, as a co-author community, wrote that article in JPPM on the refugee system, and we came up with a huge comprehensive research agenda. And I do not repeat all the questions from this web appendix, but there are several interesting questions. To research on or to focus on.
Yep.
Cliff.
Okay. There are, we really recommend everyone to check those papers out again later. Cliff, what do you think about some of those kind of more urgent maybe themes, topics, and questions?
Well, I would certainly echo all the thoughts shared there. I would add a few more things. And my macro marketing is my area. So I'm interested in complex systems. And what we're trying to do is look at refugees on a pathway from immediate disposition to their journey, which can include several stops, some settlement, often temporary, and then hopefully permanent settlement. And on this pathway, there are many interactions and potential interventions and missed opportunities for intervention that must be redressed. And so we focus on that. We spend quite a bit of time in the communities. We prefer to eschew this term camps, although some of them clearly would be camps. And we're focused on well-being measures. So I've immersed myself in the well-being community, which is very multiple disciplinary. And what are the measures of well-being? And of course, they're very culture sensitive and specific. And we say, what's well-being in Riyadh is very different from what's well-being in Rotterdam. So we try to be sensitive to that. I think the employment and skills training is very, very important, research in those areas. Giving people hope. I mean, that might sound naive or obvious, but it isn't. And so institutionalized research that gives people hope, and that includes education, women's rights, particularly a lot of the communities that I work with. And it's very interesting. We've discovered that women have actually thrived in many ways in some of these communities because they're seeing a perspective from people in a different place from where they came from, that there are opportunities for women, that they do have skills and they can be leveraged in a nurturing economy. So we're looking at these issues and complex systems that facilitate them. And I think, to me, it's really important to say, there's not a silver bullet. You have to look at these things systemically, over space, over time. We're also spending quite a bit of time now on studying communities where the refugees currently are, sensitizing them to the crisis, the suffering that they've already endured, trying to educate them about being and measuring how their attitudes toward this, about why this ultimately should be viewed as potentially good for your society and adding value to society and enriching your society. So those are some of the things that I'm focused on, I think are important, but the complexity, the movement over space and time, the nuances with each community and of course every individual, and the idea that this is not a monolithic phenomenon, that it's dynamic and it needs to be approached with many methods from many perspectives to try to come to some solution. And lastly, I think one of the most important things we can do is focus on research initiatives that actually would stem the flow of refugees, conflict resolution in places, reintegration when possible, when peace emerges, and how to make that happen so that violence doesn't ensue again. Climate change, we've probably all seen the statistics. I think the latest is without some more appropriate initiatives to stem climate change, we could see 750 million climate refugees by the year 2050. Completely unacceptable, not sustainable. So we're spending a lot of time with our research teams, and I think that's another important theme. I always work with research teams. Level of humility in your research is very, very important. To think that I can go into the Bekaa Valley and lecture people and tell them what they should be studying is foolish. So I spend a lot of time working with reputable organizations from UNHCR to Caritas to the International Rescue Committee, building teams, learning from them. What do you think are the most compelling research issues that are going to help this community now and going forward? So just a bit of a smorgasbord of my approach to this and some themes we're looking at and the research teams that we assemble. And one last thing that I think is important, and this is just a personal value of mine, I try never to do a simple one-off study. I try to start longitudinal studies, maintain relationships over time with the communities and researchers on the ground and institutions that can facilitate learning, research, and optimal outcomes for as many stakeholders as possible.
Thank you, Cliff. I mean, this was great and very helpful. What about the flip side of the coin? What are some of the challenges, in your opinion, of doing refugee immigrant-related research? Usha, just very briefly, what are some of the main challenges?
Okay, let me start at the community level, or even methodologically, for example. One of the main issues around doing refugee or immigrant research is actually, in my opinion, the whole issue around methodology. We always talk about generalizable findings. In the case of refugees and immigrants, when we do studies at a small scale, unless they are massive surveys, which we have very few, they are all kind of localized, non-random sample kind of studies. So we need to be cognizant of the fact that we acknowledge that in our thinking, in our writing, all of that. So having a random sample for studies is one big issue, and then connected to that is the recruitment issue. To get people to trust what you are doing, to get people to kind of feel that this is important for them to share their experiences with us, and also to get people to feel that we are going to make a difference. That to me is one of the biggest changes or challenges. For example, in all of our studies, we actually do recommendations for policymakers, our own Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, to see, kind of advocate for changes in the policy and practice of refugee and processing refugee needs and so on and so forth. For example, as I said, family reunification has come to the forefront of all the refugee research that we are doing, because they actually want their immediate family to be around. And later on, I can share a story. But these are issues so when we make recommendations on some of these things, I mean, it is frustrating for us, as well as, of course, the refugees, to know that not much change is going to happen. So they are, so the refugees or even the participants feeling that we are using them for academic purposes to publish our papers, to, make a good name kind of thing is a big danger that we have. So we usually work with community-based agencies that serve refugees. But even then, that big sort of gulf between, or the difference between the recommendations we make and, of course, the absence of any kind of concrete action based on those recommendations is another big challenge. Then, of course, there are other gender issues, language issues, all of that is familiar to many people who do work in the field. But to me, the most important thing is that when you identify an issue, find what is happening on the ground, make recommendations, and they sit there. I remember at some point, one of the officials of our federal ministry saying that we don't have time to read all of that. So give us in one page. So even when you give it in one page, it's very little chance that they really take that into account. Yeah.
Thank you, Usha. Silke, what do you think was some of the specific challenges as you have done?
Yeah, I totally agree with all the points Usha already mentioned, because for me also the trust issue is the most challenging issue, because you can't ask them to participate in focus group interviews without trust between the participants and then the researchers, and building trust in those communities take time. And when we think about postdocs or assistant professors, their aim normally is, of course, to publish a good ranked paper within, let's say, good time frame, and not over 10 years, so to say, to build up their careers. And that is, I think, career-wise, a challenge for the younger researchers, because we need these longitudinal studies on refugees, and it take at least double of the normal time we need for conducting a study and publishing them in a good journal. And I also agree that it's always challenging to decide as a researcher if it's a context-wise study or a more generalizable study. And of course, refugee well-being is clearly a context topic. And some of my PhDs, for example, then tried to submit their papers in refugee journals, because that is a normal, the normal feeling that it maybe fits best in a refugee journal. But no, we got the answer that our perspective is too much management driven. And this could also be a challenge in some of the steps you take.
Okay. Khalid, what do you think? What is the kind of difficult side part of doing this kind of important research?
It's interesting. I hadn't actually thought of lack of institutional support, which I think is, if I'm interpreting Silke correctly, is an issue. But I'm fortunate enough, as you are, Sertan, to be at an institution that actually encourages research in these kinds of spaces, vulnerable people, and making the world a better place. And as long as the publication is, quote, good, a pretty good outlet, or an ideal, a very good outlet, I think what constitutes very good is certainly open to debate. So institutional support is very important, certainly for early career scholars. Time and money are important, maybe not so much locally. So when I went to work with local populations, some of whom, when I say local to me, that's not so difficult. It's maybe getting the entree is a bit challenging, but that's typically a community leader or a religious leader in that particular community, and some discussions with them and meetings, and then off we go. But the international study is very, very big startup costs, and I mentioned a few of them before, but assembling teams, and I've heard the term developing trust and trust building and nurturing, the physical rigors of going to various places and having accommodations or lack of accommodations that make it demanding. Being willing to kind of work as long as you're awake and seizing every single moment and understanding, having empathic understanding of people out in the fields. And there requires emotional resolve that in the moment you might not recognize that this is very emotional research because you're on a bit of an adrenaline rush. But when you get back there can be this various epiphanies or letdowns or just trying to reconcile it all that one needs to be aware of, I think. So again, I think trust building, team building, perseverance, cooperation, and I think those are very, very important. And money. You can't get to the places I get to if you don't have money. So that typically means getting grants, which I've had some modest success with, and support, at least for logistical issues on the ground. And again, I should say for my Fordham colleague here, the Jesuit network around the world. I go to, honestly, I probably would not have started working in Lebanon were it not for a world-class university there that's a Jesuit school, and the Jesuit Refugee Services. It's been unbelievable helpful to me. So the networking dimension of this is very important. And a lot of the startup costs that some people would have, I don't have, just because of that particular network that's unique to my institution.
Yeah. Thank you. I agree with you, Cliff, on that support, institutional support, which is important. Now, we will have time at the end for Q&A from our audience. But now I have individual questions for each one of our panelists. And Silke, I will start with you. We go back, so I can just come back to you. I know that, Silke, you and your two co-author teams have recently gone through quite demanding review processes at two journals. Journal of Public Policy and Marketing, and then Journal of Service Research. I know they were quite demanding because I had the privilege and pleasure of being team member in both projects. And also I see Nadina and Palab in this call, and they were also part of our JPPM project as well. So can you please tell us a little bit about the review process? And what was the review process like about these refugee-related projects? How did the reviewers approach to the topics, issues, and all?
Sure, Sertan. So I prepared a slide. I hope I can share it with you. So only one slide, don't worry. So wait a minute. Yeah, so first of all, I would like to share, let's say, 4 topics or items. The Journal of Service Research journey for us as authors was very interesting, of course, and always not always fun in the review process. We started in 2019 and ended up in 21, finally with an acceptance of the paper. But I think the most challenging or interesting item to discuss on was the positioning and the topic of generalizability of the paper. And I thought that it's very good and visible when you read up the changes in our titles. So we first started with the title Transformative Service Research in Action and Exploration of Refugees' Access to Education, because we thought that most of the TSR papers are conceptual in nature, and applying it from the concept of TSR to a real world context is maybe enough. So that was the hope, is enough for a good contribution to a journal such as JSR. So it wasn't enough. So that was maybe the first interesting learning for us. So we came up with another version of the paper. First, we tried to really come a bit closer to the CSR literature, but that was not the point. So the reviewer and the editors asked us to, or not asked us to push us to think about what is really new in our article, and we ended up not with only applying TSR, but ended up with a new form of a TSR action, so to say, and that is what we call transformative service initiatives, and then try to make it clear what is a transformative service initiative, how can initiative help people, or not people, refugees, to get access to higher education. But the interesting point then was that it was too context oriented. And finally, we ended up with a more broader and more generalizable issue, namely enabling people to overcome barriers and focus on people with vulnerability in a more broader context. And that is maybe the learning that we already know, so that we all know that we need, of course, generalizable frameworks, but that was also a journey for us to get to that point. And then the conceptual clarity, of course, always a topic in review processes. So what is a TSR, and are your constructs clear, and so on and so on, and is it then measurable or not? But that are more or less, I think, normal points in review processes. But the struggle with the context and the passionate heart feelings of the author, that was really a huge learning for us, I think.
Yeah, I think, in my own research as well, so, all reviewers agree that refugees are a very important topic, context to study.
Yes.
But I think sometimes the journals kind of a little bit concerned about their citation numbers, so they try to make it bigger, more generalizable or applicable to other contexts as well. Yep, that was a journey for sure. Thank you, Silke. And Cliff, my question for you, you have quite an impressive background, and you have a lot of experience in doing field work in different parts of the world, as you mentioned. What are some of the advantages of doing such kind of demanding work in the field? You know, what can you share with us about the advantages of that hard work?
Well, first, for me, it starts with looking at secondary data. So I spent a lot of time poring over World Bank reports, UNDP reports, Economist Intelligence Unit reports, CIA World Factbook, websites of countries, what's happening on the ground, State Department, and so forth, just to get up to speed as much as possible. And as I've said before, other than my first visit to Cambodia, I've always gone to a place by invitation, and that requires back in the day in Vietnam, there were no diplomatic relations. So actually, and I was just finishing my PhD, I hopped on a bus, went to the UN. Vietnam had a mission there, if not in Washington, and made a pitch. And make a long story short, they said, we want you to come to Vietnam and be the first person post 1975 to talk about market economies, which in retrospect is kind of hard to believe that ever even happened, but it did. So the preparation, I talk about the preparation. So there is awareness of political economy and culture and sensitivities related thereto, and then the building of the team on the ground so that when you're there, you are aware of what the questions are. You can conduct interviews. I have a few language skills beyond English, but not in all the places where I work. So if there's not a team to help that happen, it's impossible. and a plan and some focus, but often we just start with grounded theory. It's all right, here's the phenomenon. Let's just get out in the field and do a rapid market appraisal and see what's good, what's bad, what's working, what's not working, and where do we go here for the second more disciplined study, for want of a better term. But the reason to do it, getting away from the very valuable secondary data, is to have that empathic experience. And if I throw out the word to just do this to some of your friends or associates casualty, are you aware that there are 82 million refugees in the world right now? And it will just, oh, gee, that's sad. It won't even register. Most people can't get their heads around that. But if you go out into the field and you're able to document this and do some interviews in the field, photographs of what it's like, and include these in your classes, include these. Some journals allow you to include these photos and even links to videos. Do these in your outreach initiatives that your university encourages you to do, or I hope encourages you to do. Then you put a human face on it, and then you get a response. And then you get mobilization by stakeholders who say, this is a tragedy, and it's an atrocity that we allow it to continue without efforts to stop it. So that to me is very important. I think I personally can have more of an impact with my field research, educating people back home, but also helping people on the ground. The project, the only term that comes to mind is sort of narcissistic research. I'm interested in this. I'm going to study this, as opposed to, let's go out in the field. What do they need us to study? Let's design a study that's going to be useful to the people on the ground. Minimally, they'll be more motivated to invite you in a second and third time, and more motivated to cooperate if you're actually designing a study that's going to help the people you are studying. So to me, that's very important. It's very rewarding as well in maintaining the relationships over time. But really, to close and to specifically answer your question, you cannot learn what you really need to know about the phenomenon just from the World Bank data, just from the UNDP reports. You have to get on the ground and have an empathic experience using multiple methods, and whichever one is important for the specific question you're answering.
Thank you, Khalif. I mean, this was great. And also I was taking notes. I know that some people are doing the same thing. Thank you. Usha, I know that you are the academic director of the Ryerson Center for Immigration and Settlement. Can you please tell us very briefly what your center's mission, what do you do, so that maybe some of our audience members can follow your activities and all that stuff?
Okay, so the Ryerson Center for Immigration and Settlement is basically a research center, and most of our activities are around knowledge dissemination. So, the acronym for this is RCIS. So it aims to be a leader in the transdisciplinary exploration of international migration, integration, and diaspora and refugee studies. So it's kind of a very broad mandate. And concretely, what we do is that we support research in this area. We have actually 4 ongoing research projects. We just completed one, actually 2 are ongoing. And then we mentor students. Mentoring students means that we, as much as possible and whenever possible, we offer opportunities for students to participate in research projects. And also, when they do their term papers or their final sort of a capstone project, if they think they are interested, we invite them to submit them as working papers. So they're peer reviewed to some extent internally, but they are published on the website of RCIS so that the students get a sense of, okay, we can do this. Kind of sense. So mentoring students is a big part of what we do. We have a graduate program in immigration and settlement studies. We have a PhD program in immigration policy. So there are quite a number of students who actually work in this area at Ryerson. Ryerson also has what is called a Canada Excellence Research Chair, which is a very prestigious chair. So we do all of that simply because the students have the opportunity to work on topics of interest related to immigrants and refugees and have their writing, on the website, so that they can still keep going forward. We also do what is called knowledge exchange and dissemination with governments, community organizations, and academics. Much of our knowledge exchange and dissemination takes place in the form of workshops and conferences and so on. We actually had funding to do a 2-day project on refugees, their settlement experiences, and then promising practices, so that we wanted to know what is the best advice we can give to governments and community agencies. It was meant to be a 2-day conference, but then due to COVID, we actually changed it into a Zoom conference of 8 sessions. It's actually on our website. So we invited not only policymakers and academic researchers, we actually invited community agencies and refugees themselves and asylum seekers to talk about what is it that they how experience, and how, in their opinion, things can change for the better for them. So it was a very successful sort of a series, and it was actually on our website. So, so the center on the whole stays as a kind of a coming together, a meeting point for all kinds of interests related to refugees and immigration studies.
Thank you. It's hard to believe that this is my last question, because I want to make sure that we have some time for questions from audience. And Cliff, I will start with you. At ServCollab, we believe in building collaborations between colleagues from different disciplines. And also we want to encourage our service colleagues also to look into other disciplines, other literatures, and then apply them in their research as well. So what do you think would be some non-business disciplines or field of research to look at or to check for refugee-related research?
I think I alluded or stated a few before, but and I even in my own academic community of macro marketing, there's a huge debate. Are we really a business endeavor? Are we a societal endeavor? So I'll give a shout out to macro marketing and the Journal of Macro Marketing with its impact factor of well over 4.5 for those of you keeping score on those kinds of things. But more importantly, it's an eclectic journal, and there are many eclectic journals that are interested in this topic. So I think you have many opportunities to publish outside of business and marketing. Conflict resolution literature is very interested in this. There are entire journals, plural, on refugee studies, the sociology journals, the journal, social indicators research. I think I mentioned earlier, I've begun to work a lot with the ISQuals group, which I think is the International Society of Quality of Life Studies. Very eclectic, very interested in this type of work. Mm-hmm. They have, again, their own journals, social indicators research and the applied research of quality of life studies, which is both SSCI journals. So I think, this topic, you had posited a question for us to ponder, Sertan, which was, who else should be interested in this study besides folks like us? Well, my quick response is everyone. I mean, every discipline literally could conceivably have something to offer here, and therefore their journals could be outlets. Medical journals, logistics journals, physics journals, air particulate that's unhealthy in refugee communities and its impact on well-being. I mean, there is no end to it. If you just think about what is the implication for the well-being of forcibly displaced persons, and how does my academic interest in scholarly toolkit help me to solve a problem and enhance the well-being of those people?
Yeah, thank you. Usha, Silke, do you have something to add, something additional, more specific maybe?
Right. Yeah, I keep thinking about the category refugees or immigrants. I would argue that refugees and immigrants, those categories, are really in my opinion, again, is temporary categories, because they become at some point part of the mainstream society. Then they are, they are part of society as well, and they are no more refugees or immigrants. Even though we know that skin color and the place of origin and stuff like that will never disappear, they never become irrelevant. But the whole point is that what we are trying to do, especially in social work, sociology, social policy, public policy, all of those areas, is to see how these different groups can become part of Canadian society, particularly in our case, because we believe in a multicultural society where everybody gets to do what they think is the best for them within the legal frameworks and the practices of the country. So refugees are never refugees for lifelong. They are not lifelong refugees. They are called refugees simply because of how they came and where they came from and so on. But at some point, we need to understand that they are no more refugees. They are part of the mainstream society. So anything that the mainstream society is interested in, is working on, is issues around them, definitely impacts on these new groups as well. And of course, we have to be cognizant of the fact that not everyone is impacted the same way. There are the issues around race and gender and so ethnicity and all of that kind of intersects with, these identities actually intersect with each other. And then therefore, we need to examine those as we go through different studies.
Thank you.
Sertan, I might add to that I think that the proposition is generally true, but I can think of 500,000 Palestinian refugees in southern Lebanon who might think their situation is pretty permanent.
Yeah, okay. But they're not in Canada or the US.
That is true. We have a best interest, no.
Yeah, I only want to add to this discussion that I think, of course, in all disciplines, the topic is relevant, and other disciplines also research on that topic. But that's why I like ServCollab so much, because I think it's necessary that also in the service community, we come a bit closer together and focus on that topic. We can do that with building interdisciplinary teams, but it's also relevant that submitting a paper with refugee in the title becomes a new normal. So that is nothing special or very unique. So, and therefore we need the discussions within the community and finding, other researchers within the service community that are also interested in that topic. And on the other hand, I would like to share the Ager and Strang integration theory framework with you, because I think that framework, it comes from sociology, is very helpful also for our community to better understand what are the dimensions of refugee integration. And in this framework, I don't want to explain it at the moment, but the 4 big domains are access to education, health, housing, and to employment. And I think we can contribute to all 4 domains.
Okay. Thank you all for your contributions. We have some time for maybe a couple of questions, or we can extend a couple of minutes this workshop. So I know it's always difficult, but who wants to go first? Who wants to ask any question? You can raise your hand, or just, you can ask any of our panelists.
I'm sorry.
Ryan Smith, I think your hand was up.
Yeah, thank you so much. The questions that I had before actually were already answered, so thank you so much. The question that I have now as a PhD student doing research, marketing research on refugees is, how do I refer to them in my research? Now, I have had refugees say to me that they do not want to be called refugees. They're not refugees anymore. My study is based in New Zealand. They're no longer refugees. And so therefore, my challenge is respecting them and how they feel about the wording, but still coming up with a name that reflects their uniqueness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So does anybody have any suggestions?
Cliff, you have something to say for that?
Yeah, we typically use the term forcibly displaced persons.
Mm-hmm.
And if that gets everybody, including internally displaced persons, which is the population we're looking at in Colombia. So as I'm sure everyone knows, a refugee is someone who crosses an internationally recognized border. And there are also legal attachments to that term. So I think in some cases, despite some reluctance by a refugee to say, I don't want to be called a refugee, they are technically a refugee. But you don't necessarily have to use that term in their presence if they're uncomfortable with that term. But forcibly displaced persons is I think, or maybe even more acceptable would be persons who have been forcibly displaced. Yeah. I think would be acceptable to just about everyone.
Good. Okay. Thank you so much.
If I could add, this is Usha. If I could add one point, because of the field work and the location that we are working on, we in Canada use two terms. One is newcomers, which includes immigrants and refugees who have just come as we are kind of working or understanding their main issues. But we also use the term participants. You know, that's the term that is used for all kinds of people who participate in research.
Sorry, I didn't get the last one.
Participants.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Usha. Elena, you had a question, I think, didn't you?
Yeah.
And then I will go on to Haitam.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. So it's great to put a lot of names to the faces. So I want to first thank you for you to organize, and then for the three speakers. I love the name, the 3A integrated process. I thought it was so clever when I read it. The awareness, alignment, and access was such a good framework. And my question is that I'm interested in public health and well-being. How do refugees with the behavioral health issues and needs differ in terms of their alignment and access that you found from the other, like from participants with just physical health needs?
Was that a question for Sylvia?
Yeah, I think it's a question for me. So the three names rely to our framework that we developed in the JSR article, Transformative Service Research Initiatives. We conceptualized three phases: awareness, alignment, and access. And I think when you asked what are the specific needs of people with mental illnesses, was it right? Or
yes.
Yeah. So I think the process of alignment is much harder because of the barriers that are given, and that are barriers that are not so easy to overcome compared to, let's say, financial barriers or other barriers that people may have to get access. And therefore we need, of course, health services initiatives to help these people to overcome and to get access. For example, in our University of Hamburg, we implemented a refugee integration program, and we also acknowledge or we are aware that we have in the program some people with traumata. And we then implemented also a new a service center for that, for psychological counseling, for example. And people can go there and discuss the topics with some very professionals. And we also have a cooperation with the hospital that is focusing on these illnesses, and that is a way, but it takes, of course, time. And the barrier is not so easy to overcome. Yeah.
Thank you. I see, hi, Tam, I see your hands up.
Yeah, I mean, I just have like two kind of question. The first one is related to the adequacy between the social support that we provide to refugees and their needs. I think like there is something in literature telling us that there is a kind of disconnect. And, you know, there are many examples, for example, talking about refugees who got like some help or some kind of support, like food, for example, and they sell it in the black market to get some cash, to get something else. So one of the things like in the services, I believe, like, you know, when we took a look, if we take a look to the social support, I believe that's like a big area that could be very interesting to explore, like the kind of inadequacy between the support that refugees get and, you know, their actual needs. And that's in fact is due to the reason behind this is like, we treat refugees as one pack. So rather than just focusing on their specific needs. The other thing, and quickly I want to talk about this, the refugee empowerment. I feel like, you know, we treat like always refugees as people who are helpless, they need help, they need this. And I think that could be very difficult to market, if you want to say, or even when you apply for grants, you know, I hate to take that approach, but I feel like, you know, I mean, in terms of research, there is an interesting area to explore is how to make refugees, you know, counting on themselves, like having kind of, you know, feeling of, you know, confidence, and they can build like, you know, their lives. So refugee empowerment, I think that's something that sounds even better, you know, for people who want to give you some grants and looking for fundings, you know, to do research and so on. So these are my 2 points.
Thank you. I think with that all new, more strength-based approach to vulnerabilities in general. So I think, Haytham, your point is well taken that, you know, we don't just look at them as victims, but we also look at them as potential, you know, resources for everyone else around them. And I think the COVID kind of has shown that they could be very valuable for the rest of society if they are given opportunity and if they are recognized as such. Any other, maybe one final question from our audience or anyone else who wants to make one final? Samia Petros, I think I see your hands up. We cannot hear you. Maybe you can just,
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, thank you for this interesting discussion, actually. And I don't know if I call myself a refugee, but at least I'm forced out and living somewhere. But and I have also passed through technically different issues, especially with immigration, as we know, even though I came as a student, as a PhD student, but there are always something that is really have to meet this demands of the government. And normally I call it, when you are in that process, you are not a human being, you are just a number. I don't know if you agree. Well, one of my question is, I think Yusha mentioned that about policy recommendations and the practicality. Of course, as researchers, we always publish articles, but in terms of policy recommendations, what could be? Because one of the things is, for example, there are a lot of cases mentioned. One of the biggest cases is the refugee camps. I know people living in refugee camps for more than 30 years. I engaged as a student in the 90s in Sudan to see that, but still there is a refugee camp in Sudan, and there are still people are living there. When you are coming out, you are still living in as a number until you come back 5-6 years to the system. So how do you see this from a stakeholder perspective too? That's my research interest, how we really put the different stakeholders into dialogue. I call it multi-stakeholder dialogue. So one is, how do we really put into policy level, but also as a researchers, as we are doing a longitudinal grounded study, how do you really engage those different stakeholders in dialogue? Because that could also give a very good implication to policy too. Thank you.
Anyone who wants to just make one comment on that?
Yeah, I'll give it a try for sure. As I mentioned, most of the studies that we do in Canada definitely will have policy and practice implications. At a smaller level, minor level, practice implications are relatively, I wouldn't say easy, but more practical than policy implications, simply because, as I said, sorry, excuse me, before, the bureaucrats are not interested in all these findings, and all they want is to get something done because the ministry asked them to do that. So, to tell you the truth, a lot of times it is really, really difficult to get the attention of bureaucrats to pay enough importance to provide enough importance to the policy implications, even though we know that it is coming from the refugees themselves. This is their need. This is what they would like to have. And this is what we need to do in order to get that happen. But most of the time, it's not really implemented. So there's a level of frustration among researchers for sure. In Canada, sometimes we have opportunities to liaise with our Ministry of the Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada officials. For example, one of the officials of that ministry is now a practitioner in residence at our research center, the RCIS. So, part of my hope is that, through his presence with us for the next 2 years, he'll be able to take some of this kind of very concrete, practical suggestions to his ministry to do something, because he has already flagged that the Afghan refugee situation in Canada, or bringing more refugees from Afghanistan, is proving to be a very difficult problem. And as I said before, we have so far admitted only 2,500, but our target is something like 25,000. It is presenting a lot of difficulties, especially because the families that have come here are already asking family reunification. So do we bring more refugees and then, leave that family reunification out there, or do we, satisfy that demand before we get into very difficult bureaucratic questions that, we don't even have the opportunity to contribute to.
Thank you. So I would like to thank all of our panelists, Usha, Silke, and Cliff. Thank you very much for your time. So what will come next? If you paid attention, it says Ideation Workshop on Refugee Wellbeing, Part 1, Academic Perspective, implying that there will be Part 2 and maybe Part 3, hopefully. So the next one, hopefully, will be about hearing from the ground, from the field. So Cliff, as you repeatedly pointed out, is very important. So we are hoping together to have similar panel with some representatives from different refugee organizations around the world, so that we believe that hearing their perspective also could help us. Also, our participants in this panel, our audience, you will receive a follow-up email from me asking again for your opinions and all, because we hope that we will turn this panel and this workshop into more concrete research projects going forward in a very collaborative way. I would like to thank Werner and Karim managing all our technical aspects, which I have no idea what's going on technologically, and Rodula for making us heard. She's the communication officer of ServCollab, and she's really, enabling us, ServCollab, to be heard all over the world using all different types of media, social media. And I would like to thank Ray Fisk for inspiring all of us in a way. So thank you very much. Have a great weekend. And please stay in touch and just reach out to me with any ideas, any opinions, anything, so we can take this to the next step. Thank you.
Thank you for organizing this. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All the best.
Bye.
Everyone.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.